Yesterday, we had the Supreme Court ruling that said that Trump's tariffs were not legal. Of course, now we're seeing China playing the diplomat, and it's a really interesting role for China to play because now they're saying, you know, President Trump, let's just dial this back and let's have a collaborative, cooperative relationship. And we need China. We're married to China. You know, despite the fact that Apple works with the Foxconn plant in Chennai, it doesn't mean anything. For more complex products like iPhones, we don't have the manufacturing supply chain that can develop the components of iPhones.
And so then what happens next? We get left out as a country because we are unreliable, we're full of drama, and the world just doesn't want it anymore. So I am worried about the future of our economy just based on the behavior of our leaders. Does it surprise you how quickly China can maneuver around some of the new challenges that are presented to their economy from time to time?
What China has built is not a policy-oriented process. It's a culturally oriented process. So like they've created a culture of innovation and economic focus amongst their leaders. Now, there are things that relate to that because in the Chinese Communist Party, you don't advance in the party unless you have successfully. Interesting moment in watching CNN because they were talking about this and they were fascinated by it, and it was like the CNN guy said, but they turned it upside down because apparently, you know, they know Malfoy's a villain in the Harry Potter movies. And I was like, that's such an interesting misconception of the Chinese cultural take, because the reason you turn a Chinese New Year sign upside down is because
Hi, Doug. It's good to see you.
good to see you, Aubrey. So happy to be talking to you again about just good to see you in general, but also great to be talking about these important, crazy times with China.
I know it seems like every time we plan to talk about something, the ground underneath our feet is shifting. So we need to we just need to roll with it. So what is kind of top of mind for you about China right now?
Well, I mean, as always, you know, I love to talk about U.S.-China relations, and I've really built my whole life and career around thinking and understanding about how things are developing economically in China and what the relationship between the United States and China is, and also China and the rest of the world. And to your point, the ground feels like it's constantly moving and shifting. And so just yesterday, we had the Supreme Court ruling that said that Trump's tariffs were not legal. You know, this was a big thing for thinking about U.S.-China relations. And of course, now we're seeing China playing the diplomat, and it's a really interesting role for China to play because now they're saying, you know, President Trump, let's just dial this back and let's have a collaborative, cooperative relationship. And so there's a tremendous amount to unpack here. And I still feel like, I don't know how you feel about this, Aubrey, but I feel like the world, or at least a lot of the people in the United States, still don't understand sort of the dynamics around tariffs and what they mean, particularly with our largest trading partner, China. And so I think, you know, just us unpacking a lot of that stuff, it matters. And I also really enjoyed last week when, you know, we brought in a little bit of cultural stuff. It's still Chinese New Year. Chinese New Year goes until March 3rd. And so the country's sort of on shutdown, at least from, not in the government, but for a lot of the productivity and issues that have to do with getting people on board to do things. And so it's a really interesting time. And then the one final thing is, you know, I have this one client who is very focused on building a presence in China and on sustainability. And I just think for me, it's been a gift because I'm so excited about helping China think about radical new paths.
I think that's really interesting. You know, one thing I think a lot about, we work with our clients, is how hard it is to run a global business, but then how hard it is to run a global business when everything is changing all at once. You know, like I said, you know, earlier, the ground is shifting beneath our feet as, you know, we're just trying to figure out what to talk about. But for folks who are, you know, really trying to understand where they fit and how to do business in China, what do you think is top of mind for them right now? What are you hearing? What are people concerned about? If anything, are they more concerned about the U.S. or are they concerned about U.S.-China relations?
So it's a great question, Aubrey, and I'll just say the one distinction I want to make is there's a big difference between organizations that operate at the size of Apple and Walmart and are, producing a tremendous amount in China and have many partners and are sort of the kings of export from China to the United States versus medium-sized and small organizations. And when I say organizations, I'm not just talking medium-sized and small companies, but also nonprofit organizations, but also universities, for example. And so I deal with all three of those categories. And for the smaller organizations that just have much less leverage and much less economic power to do other things, it's tremendously disruptive. I mean, to your point, Aubrey, it's millions and millions of dollars in toys that come from China to the United States, and this is light industry goods. And I was just watching the news recently and just catching up on all my China news, and there was a great segment because, Walmart exported from China to the United States. Well, as we've discussed before, Walmart is the single largest exporter from China to the United States. And, money from tariffs get passed on to consumers. So this idea that we're taxing China is ridiculous. That's not how tariffs work. And no matter what President Trump says or no matter what Peter Navarro says, that money is passed on to consumers. And so toys and clothes are much more expensive. But Walmart doesn't get hurt as much because it's just a tremendous store. But the segment that I was watching on the news was just like a small mom and pop shop. I mean, it was a family shop. I mean, they were big enough that they've been around for, they're in the second generation, and, the camera was sort of showing, rows and rows of toys. And I mean, it wasn't just a small mom and pop shop, but they're small enough that, if they raise their prices by 30%, they're going to lose customers. You're just listening to this woman who's, the co-owner of the shop talk about this. It was just heartbreaking, this is, we don't have the manufacturing supply chains in America to make even toys, let alone iPhones. Mm-hmm. And so the idea that tariffs are going to raise prices such that we will create more manufacturing jobs in America. And this woman was saying, we don't have other options. We can't produce these. Well, I mean, we could theoretically produce them in America, but all of our suppliers are Chinese. And so no matter what, we're going to get hit with these tariffs, and we're going to pass those prices on to those increasing costs on to our consumers. But it is still hurting their business. And it was just devastating, Aubrey, to listen to it, because this whole thing is just, ill-conceived and a little crazy. And now the Supreme Court has said it's illegal.
Right. Yeah. Let's talk about the Supreme Court decision, Trump's response, and then what happens next? What do you think is going to happen? So let's maybe dive into the Supreme Court decision a little bit, and then what you think happens next.
So just as a little background for our listeners, I mean, here again, when we talk about the tariff war or the trade war, the basic idea of tariffs is that you raise prices at the border so that there will be an incentive for American companies that want to sell things in China to be producing in the United States and thus help manufacturing supply chains. Right. And so, okay, there's a logic to that. There's an economic logic. Now, that only works if we have manufacturing supply chains in America. So, there are a few exceptions here where we do. For example, Tesla, which has, the largest electric car gigafactory in the world in China, also has a vertically integrated manufacturing supply chain in America. So if tariffs are put on electric vehicles such that it's more expensive to buy electric vehicles from Tesla that are shipped from China and BYD, then people probably will buy Teslas from America, and it will create more jobs. Okay, so that works, but it only works if you have a manufacturing supply chain in America. We don't have most of the manufacturing supply chains. So, for example, Walmart, the single largest exporter from China to the United States, is if it becomes the case that it's just much more expensive to buy toys and they have to suddenly find the manufacturers in America to buy toys and to make toys and clothes, we have some of that, but it will take a tremendous amount of time, and it's not worth it to Walmart to really kind of reinvest that way in America. So they'll just raise prices for consumers. So this is a tax on consumers. For more complex products like iPhones, we don't have the manufacturing supply chain that can develop the components of iPhones. And, as I've told you before, so forgive me for repeating myself, but Apple Works, when I was there, we were working with 1,600 Chinese suppliers, right? So everybody thinks that Foxconn makes iPhones. Foxconn is just final assembly. We can get into some of the details about iPhones and smartphones and computers in a little bit, but the idea that we could just then suddenly have all of the suppliers for all of the components, modules, and final assembly in the United States, it will take years. It will take years and years and years and years. And so, Apple's not going to do that. So, and of course, Apple and Tim Cook are not going to eat the costs of the tariffs, so they're going to pass those costs on to consumers. So iPhones then just become more expensive. It's a disaster for U.S. consumers. Now, the really interesting thing is that a Supreme Court with 2 Trump appointees that voted in the 6-3 position on this said what Trump is doing is illegal. Now that's amazing. Like that's, I'm sort of happy for U.S. democracy, because even though we think about everything is so partisan and there are Trump appointees, like, these individuals looked at the law and they said, the law that Trump was working under was the International Emergency Protection Act, which, the basic idea is if you're in an emergency situation, the president can invoke things like tariffs. But really, this is a congressional issue. Congress is the only organization in America that is officially allowed to think about things like taxes and tariffs, unless it falls under the International Emergency Protection Act. And, the Supreme Court said, we don't think so. So I think it, my, heart jumped a little bit, because I was like, a little bit of like American democracy. Wow. Okay. I like the Supreme Court. Okay. Right. I don't know how you felt about that, but I was like, as down as I feel about politics these days, I was like, okay. So the Supreme Court looked at the, right. I mean, did you have a feeling?
But yeah, I was pleasantly surprised that the Supreme Court went against the president's wishes. As we should have these checks and balances between the 3 branches of the government here, which is why they exist. I think in recent years, it hasn't been so clear that the Supreme Court or Congress is willing to use their powers to check the president's powers. So I was, very happy to see that. It does bode well for democracy, I think.
I felt that in my heart. I was like, okay, all right, Supreme Court, okay. So I think it was a good moment, and I think they made the right decision. You and I have talked in several episodes about just how wrong this tariff policy is, but it took the judicial branch to stand up to the executive branch and say, nope, you can't do this. This is great.
So what do you think Trump is going to do next? I mean, I know that he's saying, okay, well, I'm still going to impose tariffs. I'm just going to, do it through, Congress and the other channels. So what do you think is going to happen next? What should we expect?
Well, let me talk about this. Let me say a few general words and then talk specifically with respect to China. But, immediately after the Supreme Court ruling, and of course, Trump got, on the airwaves and lambasted the Supreme Court and said it was the wrong decision and how could they do this? And then he said, well, we're going to have 10% across the board tariffs. Now, here again, I believe that tariffs should be the province of Congress, right? Like this is just the way the economic system works in America. And so the idea that the executive branch can do this perhaps for self-interested reasons, just because he wants to look tough and he wants to kind of flex his muscles against other countries and sort of have a higher negotiating power. It's just bad politics. But he did immediately after the Supreme Court ruling announce a 10% tariff on the whole world, which again, still bad. It's a lot less than the 30% tariffs that were in place before, but 10% is still 10%. And as you and I just discussed, but I'll say it again, these are not costs on countries. These are costs on U.S. consumers, right? And so like the whole idea that he's trying to create a better consumer market and a better economy, the idea that you would tax your own population and that money goes to the U.S. government, right? And so like it's just a ridiculous situation. But he did announce this 10% tariff. Now, one of the things that I think is really interesting about Trump, and here, if I have to write an article or we have to have a podcast and I have to eat my hat because maybe he's a great negotiator, he wrote the book, The Art of the Deal. I don't know, like maybe this is just a game. Like maybe he's not stupid. Like maybe he's actually really thinking about how to negotiate. And so the next thing that comes up for U.S.-China relations is his trip to China, and I think it's the end of March, early April. So it's like March 31st to April 3rd. And he's going to meet President Xi. This is going to be interesting and important. because I think China has risen in its position in these negotiations over tariff. We started out, and you and I have discussed this before, but we started out in January of 2025 with Trump coming into power and announcing tariffs most aggressively towards China, and really made it feel like this is going to be a really tense time. And then by September of 2025, President Trump is flying to South Korea to meet Chairman Xi, and they're having a meeting that he calls the G2, which is, the group of two nations, right? So it's a reflection on the G7 and the G20. And so, President Trump was calling this the G2, like it's you and me, Chairman Xi, like we are the ones who are running the world right now. And so I know just because of the work that I do in China, a lot of Chinese people were fascinated by that and flattered by it. And so the interesting thing to your question, Aubrey, sorry for the long-winded answer, but I think the interesting thing to your question is how this plays into 2026 negotiations. And that's what I think, again, it's hard to read how much of this is just posturing and how much of it is actual real policy. But we need China. We're married to China. Despite the fact that Apple has Foxconn, or Apple works with a Foxconn plant in Chennai, it doesn't mean anything. Well, it does mean something, and we can talk about that in a few minutes, but we're married to China. Companies like Apple and Walmart and Tesla are not leaving. And so we just have to figure this out. And so it's interesting right now, if you just, before our call this morning, I was just sort of Googling news in China like I do every morning. And the Chinese are really looking like the sort of stable negotiators here. They're like, okay, post Supreme Court ruling, President Trump, let's think through like what we're doing together. And they just look like the more reasonable characters. And I think that's interesting. So it is the case now that a lot of trade looks like the tariff wars have affected the imports from China to the United States. So for example, last year, I think the numbers I just saw were about 23 billion in iPhones were exported from India to the United States, right? And as you and I think have discussed before, partly that's because Foxconn, the final assembler for China, or not for China, for iPhone, set up a plant in Chennai, right? So Foxconn's final assembly. But to our point and our question about Apple working with 1,600 suppliers, these suppliers make components, modules, and then there's final assembly, which is mostly Foxconn and the Chinese company Pegatron. So the fact that Foxconn is in Chennai and they're exporting iPhones to the United States under lower tariff rules than China has been hit with under the Trump administration, these are still iPhones that are made in China, right? And so like it's just important for people to understand like these trade wars. Yes, the tariff war forced Foxconn to set up a manufacturing supply chain, final assembly in Chennai. It didn't create jobs in America. It just created jobs in Chennai, which is fine if we want to have a trade war with China, and so maybe final assembly. But these phones are still being made in China. Mm-hmm. And so that's, even though they are exported from Foxconn Chennai to the United States and officially under the trade war policy come from India, we're still married to China. It's just not going anywhere.
Right. And I'm looking at some of the graphics you shared from Politico, and the one graphic where annual share of total U.S. imports from China by product category, which would be phones, games, computers, and other imports, and how drastically it fell in 2025. And, maybe it's a result of the tariffs and, the pressure that the Americans are feeling from, okay, this is costing more. I don't want it. I'm going to make a different choice or just use my old phone. But could it also be that these are falling because we're just shifting products to come in from India?
Coming from India and Vietnam and Southeast Asia, but they're still made in China. And that's we have to just really think carefully about this. China is very smart with how they're doing these. And so are companies like Foxconn. Foxconn is a Chinese company because Taiwan is a part of China, but it's a Taiwanese company. And they're smart too. And so, they knew that if they built a final assembly plant in Chennai, it would avoid tariffs the way that China was being hit. And so it's, anyway.
Does it surprise you how quickly China can maneuver around some of the new challenges that are presented to their economy from time to time? It seems that in the book that you were featured in, Apple in China, that being nimble and quick is one aspect of the Chinese manufacturing supply chain that might be coming into play here. What are your thoughts
So
on?
that's a great question, Aubrey. And so I'll just go back to sort of one of my core issues that I talk about with respect to China a lot. So we typically misconceive of China as an authoritarian dictatorship, which, operates out of Beijing's 5-year plans. Beijing does have 5-year plans, but you'll remember that my other favorite author in this space, Andy Walder, at Local Governments as Industrial Firms, there has been a culture that has been built on training local officials to think innovatively about the economy. And so I can guarantee you, I mean, Foxconn's final assembly plant, the main place is in Zhengzhou. And, Zhengzhou, the mayor there cares a lot about how to develop the economy of Zhengzhou, but they also want Foxconn to be successful. And I'm sure, I mean, I wasn't part of these conversations, but I know the people involved. I am sure that Zhengzhou negotiated Foxconn's entry into Chennai because they wanted to make sure that we were continuing to develop the iPhones. And so, to your point, I think there's a tremendous amount of innovation here. And by the way, I think that Chinese local officials that I work with, directors of bureaus of commerce and mayors, they are way more economically innovative than most economic and mayoral people that I work with in America. And it's an interesting moment because we could be learning from China economically if we would take the time to do it.
That's interesting. Do you think that the United States and living here and how slowly and bureaucratic, things seem to be at times? There was Freakonomics podcast episode I was listening to where they featured an author. I think his name is Dan Wong.
I know. Yeah.
I can't remember the title of his book, but his premise was that that the United States is a country of lawyers, whereas China is a country of engineers. And, that's why things just move faster in China. I think that would be an interesting topic for future conversation. But, would it be, could we just hand this local government as, what is the phrase?
Local governments as industrial firms.
Right. Could we just hand this to, the city leaders of Ann Arbor or, other, village leaders? Would they learn from that? Or does it really need to be like a systemic change in order to just like drive this innovation that we're seeing abroad?
So it's a great question, Aubrey. And I love the sort of notion of the question because what China has built is not a policy-oriented process. It's a culturally oriented process. So like they've created a culture of innovation and economic focus amongst their leaders. Now, there are things that relate to that because in the Chinese Communist Party, you don't advance in the party unless you have successfully helped your district, your municipality, or your province advance. I mean, if we look at Chairman Xi was, the leader of Zhejiang province, and under him, Zhejiang and Hangzhou and Zhejiang became a powerful economic force in the world economy, right? The same with many, many of the leaders that I know in China. Now, we could do this in America. Unfortunately, we just have partisan politics that focus on other things. But one example that I've used with you many times, I love Kay Gallego, who's the mayor of Phoenix. And, it's under her leadership and a couple of other economic leaders in the Arizona economy that TSMC initially agreed to invest $160 billion. I've recently heard that number is up to $500 billion. That they're going to be investing in the state of Arizona to build manufacturing supply chain among the semiconductor industry. That this fundamentally changes the economy of Arizona and the economy of Phoenix. That doesn't happen without leaders who think deeply about these issues. Kay Gallego is one of them, and she has people around her who are thinking a lot about these issues too. And so we could do it. I just think we are in a messy partisan politics moment in the United States history. And the irony is that we could be learning a lot from China about economic development and economics. Mm-hmm. And that's, I know that people in the United States, I've told you the story of getting a call from the State Department and telling me that I couldn't be saying things like China was better at economics than the United States is, but, they are right now. And so I just think it's a really interesting time and interesting moment.
Yeah. And I think, the pervasive thought amongst, citizens, as I've encountered folks, is there's a lot of old views of China. It's dirty, they treat people poorly. But, what I've learned from you is that's not necessarily the case.
Right. 100%.
Mm-hmm.
And I've like devoted my life to studying what's actually going on, boots on the ground in the economy in China, and that's what we do at OGL.
Great. Well, thanks for the conversation today, Doug. It was fun and nice to see you. I know you've been just busy traveling, and so it's nice to connect and just have a little bit of time.
100%. And Aubrey, I always enjoy our conversations. I always find them so fascinating, and they allow me to pontificate a little bit about China, but also just to talk to a voice who asks me really interesting, hard questions. And so
on the interpersonal level, it feels like, something I see in my scrolling is, how to avoid being people call it the narcissistic fuel in interpersonal relationships. Like, how do you avoid being fuel for somebody's, narcissistic tendencies, and it's being calm and steady,
right.
And not giving something for that person to react to. I mean, you take the things, the thing that I'm seeing every time we have a conversation is I can see countries relating like people relate. And it's just, countries are just big groups of humans run by a few humans. And it really is like interpersonal relationship skills are just sort of come up for me. And I think what I'm seeing is the United States as we stand, we've got this 4-year presidential election cycle. We've got this short-term thinking because we want to win the next election, right? We're not necessarily looking nowadays to win the global economy. We don't have this long-term strategy anymore. It just seems shorter and shorter and shorter, ripe for fluctuation and uncertainty. And especially now, right, when we have leaders who aren't steady as she goes. And, looking at the other countries, right, we talked about Mark Carney, we obviously, we're talking about China and President Xi. It's, I think the more stable seeming countries are, they're deciding, okay, we're not going to play these games anymore. And so then what happens next? We get left out as a country because we are unreliable, we're full of drama, and the world just doesn't want it anymore. So I am worried about the future of our economy just based on the behavior of our leaders. I think short-term thinking really is doing our country, our position in the world, it's just doing ourselves a disservice. And, I just think it's always interesting to look at it like just two people relating, two countries relating. There's a lot of similarities from what I see.
So I love your analogy and just sort of the psychological analysis of like the United States is the person with narcissistic personality disorder. And, then there are a lot of other countries like China and Canada and Denmark that are trying to pick up the pieces and say, hey guys, let's be sane. Like, let's just calm down. But to your point, what does this mean? Now, the one thing that I would say, I'm a little less worried than you because we do have 4-year election cycles. This president is not going to be here. He's going to be here 3 more years. But, we also have a lot of technology and we're the largest economy in the world. And even though that strength of the economy has been shifted from manufacturing labor to white collar labor, we're still needed around the world. I mean, there are still companies like Apple, Tesla, and Walmart and so my hope is that we're going to get through this tumultuous period in which we seem like the narcissistic personality disorder partner in the discussion, and then we're going to be back on track for a more stable relationship. The one other thing that I would say here is that when I say we're married to China, our ties are so deep because of companies like Apple and Tesla and Walmart that have deep ties across thousands and thousands of suppliers. And these suppliers just can't be rebuilt in India or in the United States. It'll take decades to do it, decades and lots of investment. And so eventually the economy reigns supreme. Like, we still need our toys and we still need our iPhones, and consumers don't want to pay double for them. And so I'm hopeful that things are going to even out and they're going to be okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so this is going to sound a little bit out there, but, just watching documentaries about fungus and the mycelial network and how the trees in the forest, everything is connected by this mycelial network. Everything is connected, and it's transmitting information, nutrients. There's just a lot happening there. And I kind of picture the global economy, like the countries are all the trees, right? And the roots, and then the network going through the mushrooms, the mycelial network, it's all so integrated and enmeshed. We cannot necessarily separate the tree from which is the country, from the network of people and businesses without, completely disrupting everything. Just the intricacy which relationships are built. Recently here in Ann Arbor, I've been talking to somebody, he's a store owner on Main Street here. And he's got this supplier network to China, to Japan, and how this is all impacting him. And that's just one business, one guy in one town. And thinking about how this is just across the country, these small businesses, families, there are so many relationships that are entwined, enmeshed, kind of like the root systems and the fungal networks in a forest, that it's impossible to say, okay, we're just going to, separate this tree from the forest. It's like we're all so deeply connected and enmeshed that it really does cause quite a disruption when we say, okay, well, we're just not going to talk to each other anymore. We're going to, impose tariffs. We're going to do this. And it's like, we can't disconnect from each other because we are so deeply entwined.
Right.
And like you've said, with the supply chain and the networks that have been built up over time in China, the 1,600 suppliers that Apple uses for the iPhone, you can't just replicate that overnight.
Yeah. Well, and I love your analogy and the fungal network and like the connection of all the roots. But to your point also, this kind of comes back to the earlier example I gave that was a very nice news story of, just somebody on CNN going out or maybe it was Politico, I can't remember, but just going out and talking to a smaller store. It wasn't a Walmart, but they're connected too. They rely on China too. They don't have the manufacturing supply chain in America to make all the toys that they sell in their little store. And so we need to be very careful with this. And so I just think, yes, trees, roots, fungal network, I love it. That's a great analogy.
That's how my brain works. I'm always looking for analogies. So let's talk maybe a little bit about some of the cultural things that we're seeing and that you saw on your trip to China and that we're learning from our friends who are based in Shanghai. So last week we talked about kind of the interesting thing you noticed with the Harry Potter character, Draco Malfoy, that is kind of like all over China right now because his name sounds like horse and fortune. And it's the year of the horse now. So maybe let's talk a little bit about Chinese New Year, year of the horse. What are we thinking? What are we feeling?
I mean, it's a fascinating time. You and I are part of a team that thinks of ourselves as China experts, and we think about this. And there was somebody on CNN that was talking about this Draco Malfoy phenomenon. So again, the word for the horse is ma, which is, so this is the year of the horse, and the word for fortune is fu. So Malfoy's name sounds like ma fu, and so, he's become this character. Now, it tends to be the case that there are all of these signs in China that are like the red squares that are always present in Chinese New Year. And then Malfoy's face is in the middle of them. And the character Fu, which means fortune, is right beside it. And they turn it upside down. And it was just an interesting moment in watching CNN because they were talking about this and they were fascinated by it. And it was like the CNN guy said, but they turned it upside down because apparently, they know Malfoy's a villain in the Harry Potter movies. And I was like, that's such an interesting misconception of the Chinese cultural take, because the reason you turn a Chinese New Year sign upside down is because when the Chinese New Year comes, you turn it right side up to say Fu Dala, which means fortune has arrived. So, I was just like, this is a funny moment because, we have smart people on CNN and we have smart people thinking about lots of things, but like there's still a cultural nuance to things. That they're not turning Draco Malfoy's face upside down because they think Draco Malfoy is an evil part of Harry Potter. They're doing that because that's part of Chinese tradition. So that when Chinese New Year is over, you turn it over and say Fudala. And so
no matter what the symbol is on the red square, every year we turn it up. Okay. All right. That's good to know. Yeah. And it's something, we wouldn't know unless you've spent significant time in China with living and immersed in the culture.
Yeah. Yeah, it's it's been a journey, as you know. It's been an important journey, and it's been what I've committed my life to. I love these conversations, and I look forward to our podcast next week.
All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you.